Oh my god, it's attacking the city! What is it, boss? It's a big fucking monster! What kind of monster, boss? A fucking gorilla!
Hello, I'm Christian. This is my friend Jeremy.
Hey everyone.
And we're continuing our reviews on the King Kong movies with King Kong vs. Godzilla, which is... it's technically the third King Kong movie. There were actually two King Kong movies in Japan. One in the 1930s, and one in the early 1930s, and the other in the late 1930s. But both films are now considered to be lost. One of them was actually a comedy, I believe. One of them was a comedy that was basically spoofing the first King Kong movie, and then the other one was like actually set like years and years in the past. It just happened to feature King Kong. But both those movies are now considered to be lost. From what I heard, apparently both those films, all copies of them were destroyed during the Second World War, from what I heard. I mean, there could have been other things that led to those films being lost as well.
I mean, I'm not too familiar with them, but I mean, that theory that they were destroyed during World War II, that makes sense. A lot of things, sadly, were.
Yeah. Since we're never going to see those movies, unless somebody miraculously finds them, this is the third King Kong movie. This is also the third film in the Godzilla series. Now, the film, of course, was produced by Toho, the company that produced and distributed all the Godzilla films in Japan. Now, since this is the third Godzilla film, what Godzilla movies have you seen, and more specifically, have you seen the original Godzilla?
I have seen the original Godzilla, known as Gojira.
Now, which version? Because there are two different versions of that.
I saw the Japanese version.
Good, good.
Yeah, I've seen Gojira, I've seen King Kong vs. Godzilla, and I remember seeing one of them in the 80s, but I can't remember which.
Well, there were two Godzilla films in the 80s. There was Godzilla 1985 and Godzilla vs. Biollante, so maybe it was one of those you saw?
Probably was, and I also saw the 2014 Godzilla movie.
Alright, and of course I've seen every Godzilla film, and I'm a pretty die-hard Godzilla fan, and I actually did already review this movie when I reviewed the Godzilla films, but specifically I reviewed the American cut, but in this video we're going to be reviewing both the Japanese and American cuts of King Kong vs. Godzilla. So yeah, you haven't seen any of the other ones. Yeah, there are a lot of good ones and a lot of bad ones. I will say. But even the bad ones I enjoy too.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really indulged in the series as a whole, but, you know, I've developed an appreciation for them. You know, I also met Haruo Nakajima before he passed. He was the original Godzilla suit actor, and also Akira Takarada, who's been in a lot of them. So, you know, I do have a very healthy interest in the series.
Now, the film is in continuity with the first two Godzilla films, but it does not appear to be in continuity with the original King Kong or Son of Kong. It appears to be a straight reboot of the King Kong storyline, because they don't really mention the events from the original King Kong at all.
Well, I mean, I imagine they wouldn't, considering, you know, this is a Japanese film and the original was an American film. I mean, it only makes sense that they try to distance themselves from it.
But it's King fucking Kong.
Yeah, but they want to make it their own version of King fucking Kong.
Fair enough, fair enough.
They want to, you know, do their own thing.
Now, as I pointed out before, we're going to be reviewing both the Japanese and American cuts. I have the Japanese cut right here. Now, this is actually not available on DVD here in the States. I actually got this at a convention, actually Monster Mania.
Yeah, they have a lot of vendors there who sell this type of stuff.
Yeah, and then I also have the American cut, both on VHS and DVD. Now, this was actually, of the original Godzilla series, which is called the Showa era,
Yeah.
This is actually my second favorite. Obviously, the first one is my favorite, and it's my favorite film of all time, but this is also probably, I would say, is my favorite of the sequels. This was my first Godzilla movie. I saw it when I was like 3 years old. My grandparents had it on VHS, not this VHS, but one that's long since gone. And yeah, this is what really introduced me to both Godzilla and King Kong.
Well, that's a very good introduction, I'd say.
Yeah. Now, Personally, the American cut is my preferred version because it's the one I grew up on, and I only saw the Japanese cut recently, like in the last few years. Obviously, I rewatched it for this review, but personally, I prefer the American cut. I don't know what your opinion of that is.
Well, the thing with me is, with the American cut, the dubbing is really bad to the point where it gets kind of distracting. But in the Japanese cut, you have to constantly read the subtitles, which I also find distracting.
I don't find that distracting at all.
Well, just, focusing on reading the subtitles and also, watching all the action take place.
Fair enough.
I can do it, it's just, sometimes it's better just to have it all, at once, if that makes any sense.
Fair enough. Now, the plot of King Kong vs. Godzilla, and it's basically the same plot in both versions, is an American submarine crashes into an iceberg and Godzilla comes out of it. Now, Godzilla's reasoning for being in an iceberg would actually make more sense if you've seen Godzilla Raids Again, which was the second Godzilla film, but that movie did suck too. You don't really have to see that movie in order to understand this, but him being frozen in ice would make more sense if you did see that movie. But Godzilla gets released again and once again terrorizes Japan. Meanwhile, there's a pharmaceutical company that really wants publicity, and the head of the company finds out about this island called Faroe Island, where there is a mysterious god called King Kong. And he sends two guys who work for the company out to the island, and they discover that this god is actually a giant gorilla. Long story short, they bring King Kong to Japan, and eventually Godzilla and King Kong meet and end up fighting each other. I mean, that's the plot of King Kong vs. Godzilla in a nutshell.
Yeah, it is pretty silly. I mean, I always crack up during the scene where the guys from the pharmaceutical company go to the island and they bribe all the natives with cigarettes. And they give cigarettes to a kid, and I just wow, that is just so messed up.
This line's in the American cut, but I love when the one guy's like, "It's okay, they're all smoking." It's a great commercial for cigarettes.
Not good.
So let's focus on the Japanese cut first. What do you think of the Japanese cut, looking at it as a separate movie from the American cut?
I mean, aside from the silly plot, I think it's competently made,
I think it's very well made, but Ishiro Honda, who directed this, also directed the first Godzilla film. He was a very good director. I would say the cinematography is actually really good in this movie.
Yeah, I'd say so. I like the song the natives kind of sing, that kind of permeates it's got a certain ring to it.
Yeah, that was cool. Now, one thing I will say about the Japanese version is it's much more of a satire, much more of a comedy, and that was done on purpose. It's basically a satire on consumerism and marketing, and a lot of the silly stuff that you're bringing up, I think, was done on purpose, because it's meant to be a comedy. Which is interesting because the original Godzilla was such a dead serious movie. This was the first film in the series to actually introduce comedy to it all, which actually Ishiro Honda was not really happy with. He always wanted these monster movies to be taken seriously because the whole point of them from the beginning was the original Godzilla was a metaphor for the bomb, so he wanted that to be taken seriously because he felt very strongly about those issues, but it was actually Eiji Tsuburaya who did the effects work. Because these are very effects-driven movies, he had all the power at Toho, so he called the shots, basically, and he's the one who kind of wanted the movie to be silly and geared more towards children.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, that the original director would not be happy about his very serious subject matter being turned into a laughingstock.
Yeah.
I'd be mad too.
But even though it's a comedy, there's still... The satire is meant to make a point, though, because I think what the movie's trying to make a point about is the Americanization of Japan ever since World War II. There's also the scene where King Kong's standing on top of the Japanese diet building, which was obviously a tribute to the original film. Some people have read into that that's supposed to be a symbol of American dominance over Japan because King Kong's obviously an American character in a Japanese movie. I think people might be reaching a little deeper than was actually intended with that scene, but then again, knowing Honda and knowing how political the original Godzilla film was, that also wouldn't surprise me if that was the intent behind that.
I mean, I never really looked so deeply into the symbolism of it. That's a lot of interesting points you make.
Yeah. But, I'll be honest though, I find the Japanese cut to just be kind of... There's something about it, it just doesn't appeal to me. Maybe that's because I grew up with the American cut, and as I pointed out before, that's my preferred version. Just watching this movie, I'm just like, you know what? I could be watching the American cut. And I know for some Godzilla fans that might be blasphemy, but this is one of the few Godzilla movies where I actually do prefer the American version. Even though the American version cuts out all the satire and the social commentary, I still prefer it though. The Japanese cut for me is just a little slow moving, and a lot of the humor in it, maybe I would get more if I actually lived in Japan in the early 1960s. I feel like a lot of its humor that maybe was more relevant for the time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, sometimes humor just does not age well at all.
Yeah. So now we move on to the American cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla, which I already said is my preferred version. And yes, the Japanese cut's technically better. The Japanese cut has a lot more of the social commentary and the satire, but basically what the American cut does is it basically cuts out all the satire and makes it a straight monster movie. Some of the satire is still there, but I think it was more accidental than anything. But what do you think of the American cut overall?
Well, the first thing I can say is that, my God, that dubbing is awful.
It's bad, but I've seen worse. Trust me, I've seen worse.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bad dubbing, but actually one thing I will point out is, you remember the submarine scene in the Japanese version.
Yeah.
Those actors, those Caucasian actors they had were so freaking bad. They're dubbed over in the American cut, and I actually think it comes off better in the American cut.
To be honest, I really didn't notice that, but I mean, you know, I just find it a bit distracting when the characters are speaking, and the voice that you hear clearly does not match up with the movements of the character's lips.
Yeah, but that's like, if you're gonna watch any of the Godzilla movies dubbed, that's basically any of them. That's any dubbed movie, so...
I mean, I guess I just don't like dubs then.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me, it really doesn't. I'm used to it though, because I grew up with these movies, I grew up with the Godzilla films and stuff like that, so it really doesn't bother me.
I mean, I haven't seen too many dub films, so maybe I just have to get used to it more.
Yeah. But I also feel like the American cut, the way it's edited, I think it actually flows better than the Japanese cut. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
I thought the Japanese cut actually flowed a little better, to be honest.
Fair enough.
Just because I think that was kind of as it was supposed to be, because that's where it originated with Japan, whereas the Americans kind of took it and, you know, cut it up.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, I'm just biased because the American cut's the one I grew up with. It's also the one... It was my first Godzilla movie and my first King Kong movie. Like, I remember, like, my grandparents had this on VHS, and every time I was over their house, I would be sitting in their basement, because they had a little den in the basement, and watching their VHS copy of this movie, and just... There's so much about this movie that's so iconic to me, like... I mean, obviously the fights are in both versions of the film, but, like, I don't know, like, in the American cut, since it was distributed by Universal, they use a lot of stock Universal music from other Universal films. Like, some of the music from Creature from the Black Lagoon is in the American cut, and whenever I watch this movie, I prefer that. I like hearing the stock Universal music. And I know for a lot of people that's blasphemy, because, like... What, you prefer the stock Universal music to Akira Ifukube's score? And for this particular movie, kinda, but once again, it's because it's the one I grew up with. It's the one I know the best. So, the American cut for me is this is my King Kong versus Godzilla, but I think at the end of the day, it might depend on which version you saw first.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't really have a total preference, but I'd say the Japanese one is a little better made.
Now, in the American cut, you also have these scenes where you have this American journalist who works for the UN and a scientist, and they're sort of commentating on King Kong and Godzilla's fight in the movie, which is similar to what they did with the original Godzilla, because when the original Godzilla came over to America, they added new scenes with Raymond Burr, so it's similar to that, but not to the same degree that they did with the original film, though. And something I want to point out, and this is in both versions, is in the movie you find out that electricity makes King Kong stronger, which is kind of bizarre.
Yeah, I don't think I like that. That's something that would work better for Frankenstein's monster than
It's funny
for King
that you
Kong.
mentioned that. This was originally going... A lot of the ideas for this started with Willis O'Brien back in the 30s. Back in the 30s, Willis O'Brien wanted to do a King Kong versus Frankenstein movie, but he wasn't sure he could get the rights. I guess he didn't realize that the book was public domain. Universal only had the rights to their version of the character, but he wanted to basically do a movie where King Kong fights the Frankenstein monster. That never happened, and as time went on, it evolved to like King Kong versus Godzilla, but they gave King Kong the Frankenstein-esque powers.
Yeah, that really just does not make any sense at all. I mean, King Kong is an ape. He's not... Him and electricity, that's just not something you would think of.
And then, like, specifically in the American cut, but you see it in the Japanese cut too, is Godzilla shies away from electricity. It's like, Godzilla was tearing through high-tension wires in the original film. Where the hell did this, he's scared of electricity, come from? Now, this movie did have an influence on some other films, like, for the Godzilla series, this was the first one that was really kind of silly, which unfortunately would lead to the Godzilla films becoming really, really goofy later on. But also, the octopus sequence, believe it or not, when they were doing the Kraken sequence in, the Kraken scenes in the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie, they actually, showed the crew at the scene where King Kong fights the octopus. Also, they kind of did a tribute to the octopus scene in Kong Skull Island as well.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, where he fights that giant squid and then eats it.
Yeah. Now, in 2020, there's going to be a remake of King Kong vs. Godzilla called Godzilla vs. Kong, which will be set in the same continuity as the 2014 Godzilla reboot and Kong Skull Island and the upcoming Godzilla film Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now I want to cut to two short reviews on this movie done by two friends of mine. The first short review was recorded by my friend Christian Feliciano, and I'll leave a link to his YouTube channel in the description below. And the other short review was done by my friend John.
When I was a kid, I had a very simple yet questionable mind. That is, for every stupid thought in my head, a question would follow. Like, was the world really black and white before the making of The Blob, the movie I thought was the first to be shot in color? And did firemen actually kung fu fires out of houses? That kind of stuff. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when I first saw Godzilla and King Kong, I just assumed that they were in the same universe. And the question that followed was, why haven't they met yet? A couple of years later, my question was finally answered with the film I'll be giving my opinion on now. King Kong vs. Godzilla. Now, King Kong vs. Godzilla is the film that I wish all giant monster movies strive to be. It has awesome creatures, including a giant squid, great fight scenes, and two men wearing costumes pretending to be fierce, destructive titans. Okay, maybe not that last part, but the rest of it, yes. Now, when I was a kid, and even now, really, I don't mind that in the old kaiju movies, you usually had people dress up as the monsters and walk around the toy city, or however it was that they did it. But when the new movies come out, I can't wait to see these creatures actually come to life on screen the way that I had imagined them when I was younger. But enough about that for now. Let me stick to this movie. King Kong vs. Godzilla is exactly what the title says it is. King Kong fighting Godzilla. There is more to the plot, but I'm sure Christian has already gone into it. So I'll just talk about the pieces that come together to form this behemoth of a movie. The acting is, well, for the time, it worked out okay. The script is the same thing. But a lot of these movies were super cheesy, and hey, camp works sometimes. It's the reason why I love movies like Flash Gordon and old pulp serials like The Shadow, Buck Rogers. But that'll be my first warning for this film. If you are violently against camp and hate things like Power Rangers and Beetleborgs and The Masked Rider, then I would avoid this movie at all costs. If you do like those things, then you should definitely check this out. For one thing, the cinematography in this film is phenomenal, as it usually was for all of those old monster movies. I said it in my King Kong short review that there are so many filmmakers today who can't shoot a fight scene to save their life. And yet these guys back then, who had less technology than the damn Flintstones, were able to shoot these scenes in ways that let you actually see what was going on. My problems with the film? I don't really have any, but that's not to say that this is The Godfather or Goodfellas. On the contrary. This movie is pretty much a guilty pleasure, and I love it for being as corny as it is. Overall, a really, really fun film. If you are a fan of kaiju features, then please go check this out if you haven't already. Show your kids, they'll probably appreciate it more than you do. And maybe, just maybe, grow up to remake them in their own image.
I mean, it was good and all, but I wouldn't say it wasn't really it's a little bit outdated, but I get it, like, why people enjoy it, because it's what they grew up with, because my dad actually saw it in the theater when he was a little kid, and he said that he thought it was like so funny, like two guys like fighting in like rubber suits. Taka, he kind of looked like, I remember like when I first saw him making jokes, like he kind of looks like Groucho Marx a little bit. I mean, it's not that it's a bad film, it's just, it's nothing special. I only saw it once, and it was good, but I like the idea and the concept. It just, I hope one day, I know maybe you may not be excited for the remake, but hopefully maybe for a better remake, but at the same time, I'm thinking like it's going to be CGI, but hopefully if it's done right, I may make an exception possibly.
So that was our review of King Kong vs. Godzilla, both versions. Admittedly, I kind of rambled a little bit, but whatever.
That's all right.
Our next movie review will be on King Kong Escapes.